The door swung open, and Tanith's world shifted on its axis. Not with fire, not with the sound of steel against bone, but with silence. A silence so absolute, it swallowed the howling storm outside, the crackle of her hearth, the breath in her lungs, and left nothing behind but the man standing in her doorway. No, not a man, a king. She knew him the way all common folk knew him, not by face, because no one of her standing had ever been close enough to see his face, but by the sheer weight of his presence. Alpha King Calder Voss, ruler of the Northern Territories, conqueror of the Ashenmore Rebellion, the man whose name mothers whispered to frighten children into obedience. He filled her doorway completely. Rain hammered off his shoulders and pooled at his boots. His chest heaved like he had been running for miles, and his hands gripped both sides of the doorframe so hard the wood groaned beneath his fingers. Behind him, the storm had turned the forest into a thrashing black wall of wind and water. Lightning split the sky, and in the flash, she saw two more figures emerging from the tree line, fighting through the downpour toward her cottage. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were not the pale gray the stories described. They were amber, bright and burning, shifting like fire trapped behind glass. His wolf's eyes. Tanith had seen wolves surface before. It happened sometimes to the soldiers who came back from the border campaigns, with their minds cracked and their beasts clawing for dominance. They would stumble into Brana's healing house, with their gazes caught between colors and their hands trembling, and old Brana would brew them blackroot tea and speak in low, steady tones until the human rose back to the surface. But those were ordinary wolves, shattered wolves. This was the Alpha King, and his wolf was not shattered. It was awake. Fully, terrifyingly awake behind those molten eyes, and it was looking directly at her with an intelligence that made every hair on her body stand on end. Not rage, not hunger, something deeper and stranger, and infinitely more unsettling. Recognition. Tanith gripped the edge of the table beside her. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything, to demand what the king of the entire realm was doing on her doorstep in the dead of a forest storm, with his wolf blazing through his eyes like wildfire. But no words came. Her voice had abandoned her entirely, deserting its post at the worst possible moment. And then the most powerful wolf in existence bowed. Calder's body folded. Not a collapse, not a stumble, not a man losing his footing on a rain-slicked threshold. A bow. His right knee struck the floor of her cottage first, then his left, his head lowered until his forehead nearly touched the worn wooden boards. His hands pressed flat against the ground, palms down, fingers spread wide, the posture of absolute and unconditional submission. An alpha's wolf bowed to no one. It was not something that happened. Not in any recorded history, not in any legend, not in the oldest texts that Brana kept locked in her study. The wolf of an alpha recognized no authority above its own. That was the entire foundation of alpha power, the biological certainty that no living creature outranked the beast within. And yet, here was the most dangerous alpha in the known world, on his knees, in a nobody healer's cottage, his wolf pressing his body to her floor like she was something sacred. Tanith did not move, she did not breathe. The fire popped behind her, and she flinched so hard her teeth clicked together, but the king did not stir from the position. His shoulders rose and fell with a steadiness that contradicted everything about this impossible moment. The rain continued to batter the cottage walls, the wind shrieked through the gaps in the shutters, and the most feared man in the Northern Territories remained on the floor of her home as though the storm, the kingdom, and every responsibility that waited beyond her door had simply ceased to exist. Two men appeared in the doorway behind him. The first was tall and lean with sharp features and a face that surrendered absolutely nothing. The second was broader, older, carrying a leather satchel and breathing like he had been sprinting through the storm for the better part of an hour. The tall one, the one with the guarded face, looked down at the king on the floor. Then his gaze lifted slowly to Tanith. His expression remained perfectly controlled, but his right hand drifted to the blade at his hip. "What did you do?" he asked. Tanith stared at him. "I opened my door." The tall man's jaw tightened. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sweeping the small cottage, the drying herbs on the rafters, the mortar and pestle on the workbench, the single bed in the far corner, and then returning to her face with an intensity that made her want to take a step backward. "You are a healer," he said. "It was not a question." "An herbalist," Tanith corrected, though her voice came out thinner than she would have liked. "I treat fevers and mend bones. I do not do whatever this is." The older man pushed past and knelt beside the king, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his throat, his brow furrowed. His pulse is steady, calmer than I have felt it in months. He looked up at the tall man with something close to disbelief. "Orin, his wolf is at rest." The one called Orin did not react. He simply regarded Tanith with that shuddered expression, and then his gaze dropped to the king, still kneeling on her floor, and he said very quietly, "Nobody moves, nobody touches him." Tanith's legs were shaking, her hands were shaking. Her entire body was vibrating with the effort of standing still, while the ruler of the Northern Territories knelt at her feet like a penitent before a shrine. "How long does this last?" she whispered. Nobody answered her. The storm raged outside. The fire crackled and spit. The king of the realm breathed slowly against her floorboards. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the terror and the confusion, a small, treacherous voice whispered that the steadiness of his breath was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard. And Tanith stood perfectly still in the middle of her own home and wondered, with a growing sense of dread, whether she would ever be allowed to simply be a nobody herbalist in the woods again. She was not allowed to be a nobody herbalist in the woods. Again, the following morning, made that perfectly clear. The king had eventually risen from her floor, though Tanith did not witness it. Orin had ordered her into the back room of her own cottage, which she resented deeply, but obeyed, because the man had the energy of someone who would physically relocate her if she argued. She had pressed her ear to the door and listened to the low murmur of voices, the heavy sound of boots, and then, nothing. When she emerged, the cottage was empty. The only evidence that any of it had happened at all was the pair of knee-shaped impressions pressed into the soft wood of her floor. She stared at them until the gray light of dawn crept through the windows. The knock came shortly after. 2 soldiers in the dark green of the Royal Guard stood on her threshold, their expressions carefully blank. "Miss Tanith," the taller one said, "you are required at Thornhall." "Required," Tanith repeated. "By order of Lord Orin, the king's beta." Tanith looked at the soldiers. She looked at the tree line behind them, where the gray mist woods stretched on for miles in every direction. She briefly considered whether she could outrun 2 trained wolves in full armor. She could not. "Let me get my coat," she said. Thornhall was a fortress, carved from dark stone, perched on a granite ridge overlooking the river valley below. Tanith had seen it from a distance, her entire life, a dark shape on the northern horizon, but she had never been inside its walls. The sheer scale of it stole the breath from her lungs. Every corridor was wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast. Every ceiling vanished into shadow. Every surface was stone or iron or ancient wood, darkened with age, and the air smelled of cold metal and burning torch oil. Portraits of former kings lined the passages, their painted eyes following her with the same suspicion she saw on the faces of the guards. They brought her to a small room off the main corridor. No windows, 1 chair. A pitcher of water on a wooden table that looked older than she was. Tanith sat. She waited. She counted the stones in the wall across from her and made it to 214 before the door opened and Orin stepped inside. He looked exactly as he had the night before, impeccably composed. His dark hair was swept back from a face that seemed designed to withhold information. He studied her for a moment in silence, the way one might study a lock whose mechanism was not immediately obvious. "You slept well, I trust," he said. Tanith had not slept at all. "Like a stone," she lied. Oren's mouth did not move, but something shifted behind his eyes that might have been amusement in a more expressive person. "Miss Tanith, I will be direct with you," he said. "The king's wolf has been deteriorating for some time. The details are not your concern. What is your concern is this." He paused. "Last night was the first time in over a year that his wolf submitted to anything. The first time it went quiet. The first time the king's healer recorded a normal pulse while the wolf was at the surface." Tanith swallowed hard. "And you think that was because of me?" "I do not think anything yet," Oren replied. "That is why you are here. I would like to conduct a test." "A test?" Tanith echoed, her stomach sinking. "You will be brought into the king's presence under controlled conditions. We will observe the effect, if any. If last night was coincidence, you will be returned to your cottage by evening with our apologies and a generous compensation for the inconvenience." "And if it was not coincidence?" Tanith asked. Oren did not answer that question. The walk through Thornhall's corridors felt endless. Tanith's pulse hammered against her ribs with every step. The fortress pressed in around her, all that stone and iron and old power, and she had never felt smaller in her life. Oren stopped before a set of heavy double doors. 2 guards stood on either side, their postures rigid, their eyes fixed on the middle distance. The healer from the night before, the older man with the leather satchel, waited beside the door. He gave Tanith a look that contained something dangerously close to hope, and that terrified her more than anything else so far. "His wolf is at the surface," the healer murmured to Oren. "It has been since this morning. The agitation is increasing." Oren nodded once. He turned to Tanith. "When we open this door, you will walk inside. You will stop 10 paces from the king. You will not approach further unless instructed. Is that understood?" Tanith nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Oren pushed the doors open. The room beyond was vast. A hall of some kind, high-ceilinged and lined with tall, narrow windows that let in pale morning light. At the far end, standing with his back to the door, was the king. He was gripping the edge of a stone mantelpiece with both hands. His shoulders were hunched forward, his head was bowed. And even from across the room, Tanith could see the tremor running through his arms. He was fighting something. She could sense it in the air, the vibration, the wrongness that rippled outward from him like heat from a furnace. She took 1 step inside, then another, then a third. The king's head turned, those amber eyes again, burning and inhuman. His wolf stared at her through his face, and she watched the tension in his shoulders dissolve, watched his white-knuckled grip on the mantelpiece loosen, finger by finger, watched the rhythm of his breath slow from ragged to steady. By her 7th step, the amber had begun to fade. By her 10th step, his eyes were gray, human, clear. He blinked at her like a man surfacing from deep water. His hands released the mantelpiece. The tremor in his arms stilled. Behind her she heard Dalton exhale a long, shaking breath that sounded like it had been held for months rather than minutes. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was rough and raw, as though he had been shouting for hours. "Tanith," she managed. "I am the woman whose floor you bowed to last night." Something flickered across his face. Confusion, then something sharper. He looked at Oren, who stood in the doorway with his arms folded. "What is this?" the king asked, and there was an edge beneath his voice now, the sound of a man who did not appreciate being caught off guard. "An experiment, your majesty," Oren replied calmly. "A successful one." The king looked back at Tanith. She watched him take in the sight of her, a small, rain-frayed herbalist, with dirt beneath her fingernails and wildflowers woven absent-mindedly into her braid, standing in the middle of his great hall like she had any right to be there. "I see," he said quietly. He did not sound pleased. Oren dismissed Tanith with a nod toward the corridor. She left the hall on legs that felt like they might give way at any moment, and made it exactly 12 steps before the beta caught up with her. "The king's wolf has been surfacing with increasing frequency and violence for the past 13 months, Oren said without preamble. "We have exhausted every remedy. Every healer, every mystic, every method, known to the Northern Territories and beyond. He stopped walking. You will remain at Thornhall until further notice. Tanith stared at him. For how long? Until we understand what you are. The words settled into her stomach like swallowed ice. Until we understand what you are. As though she were something other than a woman who grew chamomile and set broken fingers for a living. What exactly do you think I am? She asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Oren regarded her with that impenetrable expression. That is what we intend to find out. He paused. Your quarters have been prepared in the eastern wing. A guard will escort you. I suggest you rest. The king has requested your presence again this evening. He left before she could respond. Tanith stood alone in that enormous corridor, surrounded by stone and silence and the faint smell of torch oil, and felt the first cold tendril of certainty that her quiet life in the Greymist woods was over. The king's study was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected grandeur, perhaps a throne, golden fixtures, the trappings of unchecked power. Instead, the room was dark and sparse and functional, dominated by a massive oak desk piled with correspondence and a map of the territories that covered most of one wall. The fire in the hearth was the only warmth, and even that seemed to struggle against the chill of the stone. Calder sat behind the desk, and he did not look up when she entered. Tanith had spent the entire afternoon in her quarters, which turned out to be a small but clean room, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the inner courtyard. She had paced the length of it approximately 400 times, rehearsing what she would say when she saw the king again. She had prepared several calm and rational statements about her willingness to help, her professional competence as a healer, and her firm boundaries regarding personal space. All of which evaporated the moment she stepped into his study and saw him. He was enormous behind that desk. His shoulders were so broad, they seemed to strain against the fabric of his shirt, and his forearms, bare where his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, were corded with muscle and marked with scars that told stories she did not want to know. His dark hair fell forward slightly as he read, and the firelight caught along the hard line of his jaw. Tanith's mouth went dry. Sit, he said, without looking up. She sat in the chair opposite the desk, smoothing her skirt over her knees with hands that trembled only slightly. The silence stretched. He turned a page, made a notation in the margin, turned another page. She watched the fire. She watched the shadows on the wall. She watched him, despite her best efforts not to. Oren tells me, my wolf bowed to you, he said eventually. His voice was low and controlled, and he still had not looked at her. It did, Your Majesty. He also tells me it went quiet in your presence, that my pulse normalized, that the amber receded. That also happened, Your Majesty. He set down his pen and finally looked at her. The impact of his full attention was physical, like stepping into a current that was stronger than it appeared. His eyes were gray now, fully human, but the intensity in them was no less unsettling than the amber had been. What are you? He asked. Tanith blinked. An herbalist. I am aware of your occupation. I am asking what you are that makes my wolf submit, because it has never done that. Not for anyone. Not once in my entire life. I have no idea, Tanith said honestly. Yesterday morning, I was grinding rosemary for a cough remedy. Yesterday evening, a king was kneeling on my floor. I am just as confused as you are. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly, but the sharp edge, dulled by a fraction. The arrangement is temporary, he said, leaning back in his chair. You will be present during my working hours when the wolf is most likely to surface. You will sit in this room, or in the council chamber, or wherever I am conducting business. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not interfere. You will simply be present. Is that clear? Tanith nodded. Perfectly clear, Your Majesty. Good. She hesitated, then asked. And at night, the king's eyebrows rose. Tanith said quickly, her face flushing hot. The wolf, does it surface at night as well? Because if the arrangement requires me to be present during your sleeping hours, I should know that now rather than being woken at midnight by a guard. Calder studied her with an expression she could not read. The wolf surfaces most violently at night, he said. Then I should be nearby, Tanith replied, trying to sound clinical and professional and not at all like a woman whose heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Nearby, he repeated. Within proximity, close enough to be effective. She clasped her hands in her lap. I could sleep in the corridor outside your chambers, or in an adjoining room, or wherever is appropriate. I just need to be close enough that whatever it is, I apparently do, I can do it. The king regarded her for a long moment. You are volunteering to sleep outside my door, if necessary, like a dog. Well, I would have phrased it differently, Tanith muttered. But yes, something extraordinary happened to his face. It was brief, barely a flicker, but she saw it, the ghost of a smile. It vanished so quickly she might have imagined it, but the air in the room shifted, and when he spoke again, some of the cold formality had cracked. There is a sitting room adjoining my chambers, he said. It has a daybed. You will sleep there. He paused. Not in the corridor? Thank you, Your Majesty. Calder, he corrected, and then looked immediately like he regretted it. During private hours, the title is unnecessary. This arrangement is awkward enough without you bowing and scraping every time you address me. Calder, Tanith repeated, and the name felt strange and warm in her mouth, like a word she had not earned the right to use. He looked away first. That night, Tanith lay on the daybed in the sitting room adjoining the king's chambers and stared at the ceiling. The door between the two rooms was open, because Oren had instructed that it remain so, and the awareness of that gap, that open doorway between her and the king, made her skin prickle, with something she refused to name. She could hear him, the creak of the bed frame as he shifted, the slow rhythm of his breath, the occasional sharp exhale that sounded like a man forcing himself to relax and failing completely. She wondered if he could hear her too. Minutes passed. The fire burned low in the hearth. Tanith closed her eyes and tried to will herself to sleep, but her body was wound tight, every nerve alert to the sounds coming through that open door. Then the sounds changed. A low growl, involuntary and pained, like something being dragged from his throat against his will. The bed frame groaned under sudden movement. A thud, as though he had thrown himself against the headboard. Tanith sat up, her heart slamming. Through the open door, she could see the shape of him in the dim light. He was sitting upright in bed, his hands gripping the edges of the mattress, his head thrown back. Even in the low glow of the dying embers, she could see the veins standing out in his neck, the rigid cords of muscle in his forearms, the tremor that ran through his entire frame. His eyes were open. They were amber. The wolf was trying to come through. She could sense it in the air, a pressure, a vibration, a wrongness that pushed against the walls of the room like something too large for the space it occupied. The growl deepened, and Tanith watched his fingers tear into the mattress, shredding the fabric like paper. She was on her feet and through the doorway before she had time to think about whether this was wise. Calder, she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. The amber eyes locked onto her. The growl cut short. The pressure in the room faltered. She took a step closer, then another. His every inhale was a shuddering fight for control. She could see his skin rippling along his forearms, the shift trying to begin, and she could see him pushing it back through what looked like sheer, agonizing will. I am right here, she said softly, and she reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest. The effect was instantaneous. The rippling stopped. The amber flickered, wavered, and bled back to gray. His hands released the ruined mattress. The ragged edge left his breath. Beneath her palm, his heartbeat was wild and hammering. But with every second that passed, it eased. Beat by beat by beat, the storm inside him quieted. Calder looked down at her hand on his chest, then up at her face. His eyes were fully human again. The rawness in them, the unguarded relief, and exhaustion, and something else she could not name, made something deep behind her ribs ache in a way she was not prepared for. "Thank you," he said, barely a whisper. Tanith pulled her hand back slowly, her fingers tingling where they had touched his skin. She swallowed hard. "It is what I am here for," she said, though the words came out softer than she intended. She returned to the narrow bed in the sitting room and lay down with her back to the open door, pressing her hand against her own sternum, where the tingling had not stopped, where something warm and unfamiliar had taken root the moment she touched him. Through the doorway, she heard the cadence of his breath deepen, heard it, slow, heard the moment it crossed from wakefulness into sleep. She did not sleep for a very long time. A pattern formed over the following days, and Tanith hated how quickly she grew accustomed to it. Mornings began before dawn. She would wake on the daybed to the sound of Calder already moving in his chambers, the heavy tread of his boots, the splash of water, the low murmur of his voice as Auron arrived with the day's first briefing. She would lie still and listen, tracing the rhythms of a life that was not hers, that she had no business knowing so intimately, and then she would rise and dress and pretend she had not been listening at all. During the days, she sat where she was told, in his study, while he worked through correspondence, in the council chamber, while he met with advisors and border commanders, in the war room, while he reviewed troop positions along the northern frontier. She sat in corners and along walls and on hard wooden benches that made her spine ache, and she did not speak, and the wolf did not surface. It was the strangest existence she had ever known. She was present for the inner workings of a kingdom, and simultaneously invisible within it. The advisors looked through her. The guards ignored her. Auron acknowledged her with a nod each morning, and nothing more. Only the healer, whose name she had learned was Dalton, treated her like a person, occasionally pressing a cup of tea into her hands between sessions, and asking after her comfort with the gentle concern of someone who understood what it felt like to be a tool rather than a guest. Calder did not acknowledge her at all during business hours. She might as well have been a piece of furniture. He never looked at her, never addressed her, never gave any indication that he was aware of her presence in the room. He simply worked, and his wolf stayed quiet, and the arrangement functioned exactly as designed. It was the evenings that undid her. Because in the evenings, when the advisors were gone and the doors were closed and the fortress settled into its nighttime silence, he changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way she could point to and name. But the rigid posture softened by a fraction. The clipped, commanding tone loosened into something that was almost conversational, and sometimes, rarely, he spoke to her. "You are staring at the map again," he said one evening, not looking up from his work. Tanith startled. She had been staring at the wall map, tracing the border of the Ashen Moor region with her eyes, trying to piece together the geography of a conflict she knew only through rumor. "It is a very large map," she said. "It is a very large territory." Tanith hesitated, then asked, "The Ashen Moor border, is that where the rebellion was?" His pen paused, a beat of silence. Then he resumed writing. "It was." She waited for him to say more. She turned back to the map and studied the small markings along the border, the tiny symbols she could not decipher, the handwritten notes in a script too small to read from across the room. "You are going to ask me about it," he said. "I was not. You were thinking about asking me about it." "I was thinking about a great many things," Tanith replied. "Not all of them involve you." The pen paused again. When she glanced over, there was that flicker in his expression, that ghost of something warm that appeared and vanished before she could hold on to it. He did not speak again that evening, but when she returned to the sitting room to prepare for sleep, there was a second blanket folded at the foot of her daybed that had not been there before. The small things accumulated. Each one was deniable, forgettable, meaningless in isolation, but together they built a picture that Tanith tried very hard not to look at directly. A cushion appeared on the hard bench where she sat during council meetings. It simply materialized one morning, unremarked upon by anyone, though the bench had been bare wood for the entire week prior. When she looked at Calder, he was deep in conversation with a border commander and did not glance her way. The tea changed. For the first several days, the servants brought her whatever was standard, a bitter dark blend that tasted like boiled bark. Then one morning, it was chamomile, her favorite. She had mentioned it once, in passing, to Dalton. She had not mentioned it to the king. The fire in the sitting room was always lit before she arrived in the evenings, though she had never seen anyone tend it. The wood was always fresh, always stacked in the neat triangular formation that burned longest through the night. Someone was paying attention to her comfort with a precision that bordered on obsessive, and that someone was going to extraordinary lengths to ensure. She did not know it was him, but she knew. She knew, because one evening arriving earlier than usual, she caught him in the act. He was crouched before the hearth in the sitting room with a log in his hands, his back to the connecting door. He froze when he heard her footstep. The sight of the Alpha King of the Northern Territories on his knees building a fire for a nobody herbalist was so absurd and so unbearably tender that something behind Tanith's ribs constricted painfully. He stood quickly brushing his hands on his trousers. "The servants were busy," he said. "Of course," Tanith agreed. "I was merely passing through." Naturally, his jaw tightened, and he left the room without another word. But Tanith stood beside that fire, for a long time, her hand resting over her heart, where something warm and fragile was growing roots. She did not know how to pull up. The nights followed their own rhythm. She would lie in the sitting room and listen to him settle. Sometimes the wolf stirred, a low growl, an edge of amber pressure in the air, and she would call his name softly through the open door, and the pressure would recede. Sometimes he slept through without incident, and she would lie awake anyway, listening to the cadence of his breath, memorizing its rhythm without meaning to. She began to notice things she had no right noticing. The way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was frustrated, the way his handwriting changed, depending on his mood, tight and angular when he was tense, looser and almost elegant when something had gone well. The way he paused in doorways just for a fraction of a second, as though bracing himself before stepping into any room she was not in. The way he held his pen differently when writing personal correspondence, his grip loosening, his shoulders dropping an inch, as if the act of writing to someone he cared about required a different version of himself than the one who commanded armies. She noticed, too, that he ate very little. Meals arrived on trays that were taken away barely touched. Dalton had mentioned that the wolf's deterioration was taking a physical toll, and Tanith could see it now in the sharpening of his cheekbones, the shadows carved beneath his eyes that deepened by the week. She wanted to say something. She wanted to tell him to eat, to rest, to stop carrying everything alone, but the arrangement did not include permission to care, and so she said nothing and watched and worried in silence. One night, she could not sleep. Her mind was restless, circling the same unanswerable questions. What was she doing here? What was she becoming? How long could she live in the margins of someone else's life before she forgot what her own looked like? She began talking. Not to him, exactly, more to the dark, to the ceiling, to the open doorway between their rooms. She told the story of old Brana, finding her as a child, 4 years old and half feral, living on stolen vegetables from the village gardens and sleeping beneath the roots of an oak tree. How Brana had brought her home and fed her and never once asked where she had come from because Brana understood that some questions did not have answers worth hearing. She talked about learning to identify plants by taste and smell before she could read. About the first time she had set a broken bone, her hands shaking so badly she thought she would make it worse, and Brana standing behind her saying, "Steadier now, steadier," until her fingers obeyed. About the satisfaction of knowing that her hands could fix things even if she could not fix herself. She did not know when she stopped talking. She did not know when sleep finally took her. "But in the morning," Calder said, without looking up from his correspondence, "Brana sounds like a remarkable woman." Tanith went very still. "She was," she said quietly. He nodded once, his pen moving across the page, his attention seemingly absorbed by the document in front of him. But Tanith saw the way his hand had paused before he spoke, saw the way he held himself, careful and deliberate, like a man choosing his words the way a surgeon chose an incision point. "You should tell me more about her," he said. "It helps." Tanith looked at him. "The stories help you sleep?" His ears went slightly red, and he did not answer. That night, and every night after, Tanith talked. And every night, somewhere between the tale of Brana's disastrous attempt to train a wildcat and the story of the traveling merchant who sold Brana a crate of rare medicinal roots that turned out to be ordinary turnips, the king of the Northern Territories fell asleep to the sound of her voice. And every morning, he remembered every word. The first time it happened properly, Tanith was not prepared. She had grown comfortable. That was the danger. Weeks of routine had sanded down the sharp edges of fear and replaced them with something softer, more treacherous. She no longer flinched when she heard Calder move in the next room. She no longer counted the stones in the walls to calm her nerves. She had begun to look forward to the evenings with an anticipation that she refused to examine too closely. It was that comfort that left her unguarded when the wolf broke through at midnight. She woke to a sound that was not human. A roar that shook the walls of the sitting room and vibrated through her bones. The daybed lurched as something massive struck the connecting wall, and plaster dust drifted down from the ceiling like snow. Tanith threw herself off the daybed and ran through the doorway. The king's chambers were in ruins. The desk was overturned. A chair had been reduced to splinters against the far wall. The curtains hung in shreds, and the mirror above the mantelpiece had cracked down the center, splitting Tanith's reflection into two halves as she stumbled into the room. Calder stood in the center of the destruction. His shirt was gone, torn away during the shift that had only half completed. His skin rippled with fur that emerged and receded in waves, his hands caught between human fingers and something clawed and terrible. His eyes blazed amber, and the growl that poured from his throat was continuous, a vibration she felt in her bones. He was lost. She could see it. The man was drowning beneath the wolf, and the wolf was drowning beneath something else, something that drove it to rage and violence with a relentlessness that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with agony. "Calder," she said. The amber eyes found her. The growl hitched. She crossed the room. Glass crunched beneath her bare feet, and she did not stop. She walked straight to him and pressed both palms flat against his chest, over his heart, where the fur rippled and the skin burned with fever heat. The effect rolled through him, like a wave breaking. She felt it beneath her hands, the moment the wolf's grip loosened, the moment the tremor in his muscles began to ease. His breath fractured into ragged gasps, and then his hands came up and gripped her forearms, not pushing her away, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that was coming apart. "Come back to me," she murmured. "Come back." His forehead dropped to her shoulder. His full weight sagged against her, and she braced her legs and held him upright, while the shift receded, and the fur melted back beneath his skin, and the claws retracted into human fingers that dug into her arms hard enough to leave bruises. "Come back," she said again, softer now. And her hand moved of its own accord from his chest to the back of his neck, her fingers sliding into his hair, holding him against her. The ragged edge left his breath. His grip loosened. He did not pull away. Minutes passed. The ruined room settled around them. Glass glittered on the floor in the dying firelight, and the cold night air poured through the shredded curtains, and Tanith stood in the wreckage of the king's chambers, with his head on her shoulder and his arms around her, and felt something inside her crack open that she would never be able to close again. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were gray, exhausted and ashamed, and something else, something raw, that he shuddered immediately. "You are bleeding," he said, his voice wrecked. Tanith looked down. Her feet were cut from the broken glass. She had not noticed. "It is nothing," she said. "It is not nothing." He pulled back, and the loss of his warmth hit her like a physical blow. He moved to the washstand and retrieved a cloth, his movements stiff and controlled, every line of his body radiating self-disgust. "Sit," he ordered. "Calder, it is just glass. Sit down." She sat on the edge of his bed, because it was the only piece of furniture still intact. He knelt before her and took her foot in his hands, and the sight of the Alpha King on his knees, for the second time in their acquaintance, this time pressing a damp cloth to the sole of her foot, with hands that trembled slightly, made her throat close. "You should not have come in," he said without looking up. "When the wolf takes over, I cannot control what it does. I could have hurt you. You did not. I could have." His grip on her foot tightened fractionally. "You should have stayed behind the door and listened to you destroy yourself." Tanith shook her head. That was never going to happen. He went still, his thumb resting against her ankle, his head bowed. The firelight caught the scars on his shoulders, a map of old violence that she had been carefully not studying for weeks. "This cannot continue," he said quietly. Tanith's heart lurched. "What do you mean?" "The wolf is getting worse. The episodes are escalating. Oren and Dalton believe my presence is managing the symptoms, but the underlying cause is progressing." He looked up, and the anguish in his eyes made her breath catch. "If I lose control completely during one of these episodes with you in the room—" "You will not," Tanith said firmly. "You do not know that. Your wolf bowed to me," she reminded him. "It has never done that to anyone. Whatever is happening between us, whatever I am to your wolf, it will not hurt me." The words hung between them. "Whatever I am to your wolf." She had said it, without thinking, and now the implication filled the room like smoke. Calder released her foot and sat back on his heels. He looked at her, really looked at her, and in the dim and ruined room, with glass on the floor and cold air streaming through torn curtains, Tanith felt more exposed than she had ever felt in her life. "What are you to my wolf?" he asked, and his voice was barely audible. Tanith opened her mouth and found she had no answer, or rather, she had an answer that terrified her so completely she could not give it voice, because she knew. She had known for days, maybe longer. The warmth when they were close, the restlessness when they were apart. The way her own wolf, dormant and quiet her entire life, had begun to stir somewhere deep inside her like something waking from a long sleep. "I do not know," she lied. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he stood, offered his hand, and helped her to her feet. "Dalton will see to your cuts properly," he said, his voice carefully neutral again. "I will have the room repaired." He walked her to the door. His hand hovered at the small of her back without touching, guiding her through the debris, and the ghost of that almost contact burned through the fabric of her nightgown like a brand. At the doorway, he paused. "Tanith." She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for coming in." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and walked away down the corridor with her feet stinging and her heart hammering, and the absolute, devastating certainty that she was falling in love with a man she could never have. Because bonds were for people who mattered, people with bloodlines and standing and names that meant something, not for foundlings raised by village healers. Not for women whose earliest memory was sleeping beneath the roots of an oak tree because no one in the world had wanted her enough to provide a bed. Whatever the king's wolf saw in her, the king himself would never choose her. She was useful, she was convenient, she was a tool to manage his condition, nothing more, and yet her traitorous heart would not stop reaching for him. Dalton found her in the corridor the next morning, his expression grave. "We need to speak," he said, pulling her into a small alcove off the main passage. Privately, Tanith braced herself. The healer's face held none of its usual gentleness. He looked like a man delivering a diagnosis he wished he did not have to give. "I have been monitoring the king's readings since you arrived," he began. "His pulse, his wolf activity, his sleep patterns. The data is undeniable. When you are in proximity, the wolf retreats. When you are absent, even for a few hours, it surges back with greater force than before. I know this," Tanith said carefully. "That is why I am here." Dalton hesitated, then pressed on. "What I have not told Oren, what I have not told anyone yet, is that the pattern is not merely calming. It is bonding." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. Your biological signatures are synchronizing, Dalton continued, his voice low and urgent. Your heart rates align within minutes of shared proximity. Your scent has begun to carry traces of his pheromonal markers, and his carry traces of yours. These are not the signs of a sedative effect. These are the signs of a mating bond in its earliest formation. Tanith felt the blood drain from her face. That is not possible. I assure you it is. Dalton's eyes were steady and kind and relentless. The bond is forming, whether either of you acknowledges it or not, and there is a complication. Of course there is, Tanith whispered. The king's wolf is deteriorating because something is attacking it from within. I do not yet know what. Poison, curse, something I have not identified. But the wolf is dying, Tanith. Slowly, painfully, it is being consumed. Your presence slows the progression, but it does not stop it. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was very quiet. If the wolf dies, the king dies with it. And if a bond has formed between you, even an incomplete one, I die too, Tanith finished. Dalton did not contradict her. The ground beneath her feet felt suddenly insubstantial, like the stone floor might give way and drop her into nothing. She pressed her back against the alcove wall and forced herself to breathe. Does he know? She asked. About the bond? Dalton shook his head. I wanted to tell you first. You deserve the choice of what to do with this information. What choice? Tanith laughed, and the sound came out brittle. Leave and die slowly. Stay and die when he does. Dalton placed a steady hand on her shoulder. There may be a third option, if we can identify what is killing his wolf and stop it. The bond could save you both, but that requires him to know. And it requires him to let you close enough to help. Tanith thought of Calder's face, the night before, the shame in his eyes when the wolf receded. The way he had knelt before her and cleaned her feet, with trembling hands, radiating self-disgust so thick she could taste it. He will not let me help, she said. He thinks he is putting me in danger by being near me. Then we have a problem, Dalton replied, because being away from him is far more dangerous. She did not tell Calder. She did not tell anyone. She returned to the routine and tried to pretend that the knowledge was not eating her alive from the inside. But her body knew. Her wolf knew. The dormant creature that had slept inside her for 23 years was now fully awake, and it ached, constantly. A dull, persistent throb beneath her ribs that intensified when Calder left the room and eased when he returned. She caught herself turning toward doorways before he appeared. In them, caught herself inhaling when he passed, close enough for his scent to reach her. Caught herself leaning toward him, during the long, quiet evenings, like a plant, bending toward light. If Calder noticed, he said nothing, but she saw changes in him too. His gaze lingered on her a beat too long before he caught himself. He stood closer than necessary when they moved between rooms. Once, reaching for a document on the desk while she sat nearby, his hand brushed her shoulder, and the contact lasted exactly 1 second longer than accidental. Neither of them spoke about it. The silence between them grew heavier and more charged with each passing day, and the weight of everything unsaid pressed down on Tanith, until breathing itself felt like labor. She lay awake at night and pressed her hand against her sternum, where the ache lived. And she wondered whether this was what drowning felt like. Not the violent, thrashing kind, but the slow kind, where the water rose so gradually you did not notice, until it was already past your mouth. Then the night came when everything shattered. She woke to amber light, flooding through the open doorway. Not firelight. The light was coming from him. Calder stood in the center of his chambers, his entire body emanating a faint golden glow that pulsed in rhythm, with a heartbeat she could feel in her own body. The wolf was not just at the surface, it was erupting. Tanith ran to him. She pressed her hands to his chest, called his name, did everything that had worked before. But this time, the amber did not recede. His eyes blazed down at her, wild and agonized, and she felt his hands grip her waist, felt his fingers dig into her hips as the wolf surged and fought and screamed inside him. I cannot hold it, he gasped. Tanith, get away from me. She pressed closer instead, wrapped her arms around him, and held on. His body shuddered against hers, and the golden light flared so bright she had to close her eyes. And then she was somewhere else, a forest. Dense, suffocating, the trees growing so close together, their trunks touched. The air was thick with the smell of burning, not fire, but something organic, flesh, bone, memory. The sky above was the color of a bruise, purple, black, and starless, and the ground beneath her bare feet was soft and warm and wrong. Calder stood ahead of her, not the king. Something smaller, diminished, a version of him stripped of every defense, every title, every wall he had built between himself and the world, and surrounding him, pressing in from every direction, were wolves. Dozens of them. Their eyes glowed amber, their mouths hung open in silent howls, and they were burning. All of them, their fur smoldering, their skin cracking and peeling, and they pushed inward toward Calder with the patient, relentless pressure of a tide that would not be denied. This was his prison. This was where his wolf went every night. This was what was killing him. "Calder!" she screamed. He did not turn. He stood with his head bowed and his arms at his sides, and let the burning wolves press closer. And Tanith understood, with a horror that nearly drove her to her knees, that he was not fighting them because he did not believe he deserved to be free of them. She grabbed his hand and pulled with everything she had. She woke gasping on the floor of his chambers. Calder was on his knees beside her, his hands cradling her head, his face white with terror. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "Tanith, look at me. Are you hurt?" "The forest," she managed, her voice cracking. "The burning wolves. Calder, I was there. I saw it." The color drained from his face, so completely he looked like a man carved from ash. "No, that is not possible." "It is," Tanith said, gripping his wrists. "I was there, and you were letting them come for you." He pulled away from her. The withdrawal was not gentle. He wrenched himself back, putting distance between them so abruptly that her hands grasped at empty air. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said, and his voice had gone cold and flat in a way that frightened her far more than the amber or the growling or the burning wolves. "You are being pulled into my destruction. Whatever bond my wolf is trying to form with you is dragging you into a place you cannot survive. Calder, listen to me." "No." He stood, and the word came down like a wall between them. "This arrangement is over. You are leaving Thornhall in the morning." Tanith scrambled to her feet. "You cannot be serious. I will have Orin arrange an escort back to your cottage. You will be compensated for your time. Your life will return to what it was." "And what about your life?" Tanith demanded, her voice rising. "What happens to you when I am gone, and the wolf tears you apart with no one to hold it back?" "That is my concern," he said, "not yours." "It is my concern," she fired back, the words ripping out of her before she could stop them. "Because I feel it too, Calder. Whatever is happening to you is happening to me. The pull, the ache, the way I cannot breathe properly when you leave a room. That is not proximity. That is not a sedative effect. That is a bond. And you know it." The silence that followed was devastating. He stared at her across the ruined room, and she watched something break behind his eyes, a wall giving way, a dam collapsing. For one terrible, beautiful moment, she saw everything he had been hiding. The longing, and the fear, and the desperate, furious love of a man who believed that the best thing he could do for the person he cared about was to destroy himself, alone. Then the wall rebuilt, his expression locked down, his jaw set. "Leave," he said. "That is an order." Tanith flinched. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed in front of him. "Fine," she whispered. She walked out of his chambers on cut and bleeding feet, and did not look back. In the corridor, she pressed herself against the cold stone wall and slid to the floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees and pressed her forehead against them and let the tears fall in the dark. He was sending her away to save her. She understood that. She even loved him for it. But he was wrong, and by the time he realized it, it would be too late for both of them. Tanith did not leave Thornhall. She tried. She packed the few belongings she had accumulated, folded the blankets on the daybed she would never sleep on again, and stood in her quarters with her coat buttoned to her chin, and her hands shaking at her sides. The escort Oren had arranged waited in the courtyard below, 2 guards and a horse, silhouetted against the pale gray of early morning. She made it as far as the main staircase before her legs buckled. The pain came, without warning. Not sharp, not sudden, but deep. A crushing pressure behind her ribs that stole the air from her lungs and dropped her to her knees on the stone landing. Her vision swam. The walls of the staircase tilted, and she gripped the banister with both hands while the world dissolved around the edges. Her wolf howled inside her, silent and desperate and furious. It clawed at her from within, tearing at whatever tether held her together. And the message was as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. You cannot leave him. Dalton found her on the stairs. He took one look at her face, pressed his fingers to her wrist, and swore under his breath, with a viciousness that was startling from such a gentle man. How far did you get? He asked, already pulling her arm over his shoulder. The stairs, Tanith managed through gritted teeth. The bond is punishing you for trying to separate, Dalton said, half carrying her back toward the infirmary. Your body is in revolt. Pulse, erratic, temperature dropping, your wolf is in distress. He shouldered open the infirmary door and eased her onto a cot. This is exactly what I warned you about. I know, Tanith whispered, pressing her palm flat against her sternum where the ache was centered. But he ordered me to leave. Dalton pulled a chair beside her cot and sat heavily. Then he needs to be told the truth. The bond, the synchronization, the fact that sending you away will kill you both. He will not listen to me. Then perhaps he will listen to someone else. Dalton left her in the infirmary and went looking for Oren. Tanith lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and counted her own heartbeats, which stuttered and faltered in a rhythm that did not feel sustainable. She did not know how much time passed, an hour, maybe 2. The pain ebbed and flowed like a tide, sometimes bearable, sometimes so acute she curled onto her side and pressed her fist against her breastbone. Voices in the corridor. Dalton's measured tone, Oren's clipped responses. And beneath them both, getting closer, the sound of boots moving too fast for a man who was supposed to be calm. The infirmary door swung open. Calder filled the doorway. He was pale, paler than she had ever seen him, and his chest was heaving, and the look on his face was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Not anger, not command, terror. The raw, annihilating terror of someone who had just been told that the person he sent away to save was dying because he sent her away. Tanith, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer and an apology and a wound, all at once. He was across the room in 3 strides. He dropped to his knees beside her cot. His hands found hers, and the moment their skin touched, the ache behind her ribs eased so sharply, she gasped. I did not know, he said, gripping her hands like he was afraid she would dissolve. Tanith, I swear to you, I did not know the bond would do this. I thought I was protecting you. I know, she whispered. If you had reached the forest, if you had gotten any further from me, his voice broke. He pressed her knuckles to his forehead and held them there, his shoulders shaking. Oren stood in the doorway, his expression controlled as ever, though Tanith noticed his hand rested on the doorframe, with a grip that suggested even the beta was not entirely unmoved. Dalton has explained the situation, Oren said, his voice carefully level. The bond is real.